Okay, welcome everyone. I am Ravi Shankar, and this is Isobreak, the joint production between Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop. And we have a terrific lineup. I'm going to bring everyone on screen. Let me just remove this. So, as many of you know, ISO Break has been happening. This is the 19th episode. We'll have the 20th episode right before the annual conference, and very exciting that we're going to be in person again. The Asia Pacific Writers and Translators has a conference planned in Bangalore in November. And those of you that don't know, you can check apwriters.org. But it is kind of a movable feast. The previous conferences have taken place in Bali and Manila and New Delhi and Bangkok and Guangzhou and the Gold Coast in Australia. And so it really is a pretty special organization, and it's really nice that we'll be back in person. So I just wanted to tell everyone about that. And we will proceed as we normally do. We're going to hear from these amazing writers who are coming from different parts of the world, different parts of the country. And then there will be some time for some conversation. So those of you who are interested, oh, there's Francis. Hi, Francis. I encourage you to ask questions, especially if you're on Facebook. They will kind of come up, and I will certainly put it into the queue when we're talking to everyone. So welcome. It's a real pleasure to be back with ISO Break. So let me... And our first reader of the day is Oka Karyana Baroka, who is the editor of Modern Poetry and Translation, a writer and artist from Jakarta, Indonesia, and her work has been presented widely internationally and centers disability justice as anti-colonial practice and environmental justice. She's been Modern Poetry and Translation's inaugural poet in residence, UNFPA Indonesian Young Leader Driving Social Change, an art forum must-see artist and associate artist at the National Center for Writing. Her books include Indigenous Species, Rope, and she's the co-editor of Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back. Her most recent installation, and I think this is one of the very exciting things, is we have today writers who are also performers, who also do multimedia work, who work in a number of different kinds of genres. Her most recent installation was at the Museum Nasional for Jakarta Biennial, and her latest book is Ultimate Orangutan, and it was shortlisted for the Barbellion Prize. So, Oka, what a pleasure. Welcome. Thanks
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much
being
for
here.
thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone tuning in. So I guess I'll just begin. So these are poems from my most recent book, as mentioned, Ultimatum Orangutan or Ultimatum Orangutan in Indonesian. It's a bilingual title. Orangutan is an Indonesian word. Every time you say orangutan, you're speaking Indonesian. So orang means person or people, and utan means forest, which kind of underlies the whole ethos of this book. And the cover is kind of my hand against a bulldozer with a Hadouken, and there's purple paddy fields from my mom's homeland of Tanah Datar, West Sumatra in the background. I'm an Indonesian woman with short black hair, lipstick, and earrings, and I'm wearing frankly, I'm wearing an Indonesian house dress, but they're just so comfy. I just wear them everywhere. So here are some poems from Ultimatum Orangutan. Time Machine. Big Ben unfolds towards me, chimes once, another gong, and the bones feel it insipid. Empire, it pummels into us residents of Simon Lodge at St. Thomas's Hospital. Empire, echo, echo, heals you and causes flexible hurt. Empire bombs just so far enough, root cause swept sideways, canals of pain a labyrinth, persimmons brought to a man here, visitor proffered, cauterizing the ache with truth. Honey love, sustenance, persistence, pert fruit. Ease guilt at living on this little isle and none of the two you came from. This the biggest pain center in Europe, your medication too dear in Jakarta. Circular logic. Pain apothecary here, pain apothecaries there in felled rainforest. Every pain you felt caused by a not here. Not here understanding by science, nor the other kind, not here consistency, not here generosity of an imagined coherent universe. Eating gluttonous systems alive is entwined with their habitation. History is now, is that enough to spur self forgiveness? Eat what is given of the old growth sucked away from your grandfather's land. Notice the eyes of a child brim light as the fountain outside churns its undying spectacle. Sort your clothes on the hangers, thank the orderlies. Take care not to mess the giant bell ding-donging dinner. This is entitled In Which I Hypnotize a Tiger. So in Minang culture, we call tigers iniak, which means grandparent, and we believe that ancestors come back to the earth in the guise of tigers. In Which I Hypnotize a Tiger. Not made for Blake quotes and Tinder profiles, not squandered for bullets slung as attempts at gumption, not slit with knives on colonist orders, then strung up, not sold to a venture capitalist who'll place her pale feet in heels and on you, not vanishing, not a chipmunk-cheeked emoji, not bedtime threat to children in cold climates, not CGI recreation with an underappreciated actor voicing you, not a bevy of ill-advised tattoos, not the hangover, not sports team embodiment, not go get 'em, not taxidermy, not species forgotten, not a name used for foreplay, not a fantastic form of balm for soothing creaking muscle tissue, not a totem for my calming alone, not tired and misunderstood and hiding and rotting and gone. Scream without shame or fear of banishment. This is no forest of wounding, tribulation, dust of your bone. Lick your paws, open your eyes. This one is entitled Rest Stop. Body reminds me to love thyself with a harpsichord of crowing nerves, and so the beats for rest, and so reminds alive, alive. And now with medicine finally, body a kinder weather vane more often. Body is everything underneath and between the weather. The weather is what is everything it withstands, and so not a droplet of hate for body since breaking began in it only when called for, infernos of weather. Laughingly, I realize that this is what's meant by under the weather for me, by weathering, pain, imprint of and on unique body mind, crackles, stutters within, and so the beats for rest. And so, man, what is productivity unit of self is not alive, alive. Dear body, slight body, ephemeral mass. I hum not to weather, to rush of lost seeking, to able assumption spoon fed to the mob, time ticking markets of stock at the altar of rainforest used as pawns. This is not the song. To body goes humming, goes all the hum. This is entitled Pylons. I am writing from a drowning ship. I am infested with burnt and breaking pylons. A shock to the limbic system of a rainforest. I am fracked nervous systems. I am writing from the underwater debris of a coral reef blasted. Am enraptured, fascinated by the glow of a supernova that is our own destruction. I am the palms of your mother in the dead of night, when all rushes to extinction, and constellations swarm your body, reminding you of what is here still. This is a poem entitled The Event. When sky stone fell into the earth, the smoke blackened all of celestial dome. Tree bark grew thick with scales of ash. The heat rose, water flew, boiling ether choked the beasts, and they collapsed into mass graves set in this lone blue marble, weighted in the depths as calcium. Cainozoic era begun with the largest of endings, botany and fauna slain, punto, Zeus's grenades slung across the Cretaceous tertiary boundary, now Ukraine, now Mexico, now North Sea, now west of Mumbai, and the Deccan traps sparking ruby volcanoes, rattling maniacally, suffocating leaves. I sit in wonky wheelchair, museum provided, my friend vertical behind me. Tyrannosaurus rex moves his silly twin forelimbs about before us, electric strands moving his painted neck, head aloft like a chicken's. We missed them by too many millions of years. We rebuilt from hunch and stringed paths connecting phyla. Preferential choice to resurrect those with eyes, a menace in their paws, phylum Chordata. My friend will buy me a tear-shaped stone in the shop, tinged just like Sugu's orange-flavored candy. And we'll lie down, discuss vile scourge that's human populace, apologize quietly to theropod dinos, descendants eaten with sweet potato fries. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oka. And we will hear from Oka at the end of our discussion. Welcome, everyone. I am Ravi Shankar again. This is APWT in the New York Writers Workshop Isolation Break. And I should say, New York Writers Workshop is going to be starting a new reading series in New York in case anyone is interested. And let me see if I can share that with you. Hold on. Okay. And so the first event is it's the New York Writers Workshop at Underland Gallery. I'll be reading as part of it. It's Saturday, September 17th in Bay Ridge, New York. So part of the ongoing outreach that New York Writers Workshop does. Those of you that don't know, we just did an immersive writing workshop in Athens, Greece, and we'll be looking at doing something in Mexico next year. All right, excellent. We have next, and I'm really delighted today because I have a couple of really old friends who I haven't seen in a while, including Brian Thawara, a terrific poet. He is the Lao Minnesotan Poet Laureate and also the president, and we'll talk about this more in our conversation, of the International Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. He's been the president for 6 years and apparently just stepping down, hopefully leaving it in good hands. He's received over 20 awards for his work, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Literature, a Joyce Award, and he's represented Laos at the London 2012 Summer Games as a cultural Olympian. He's presented his work at the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the Loft Literary Center right in Minneapolis, Poets House, and numerous other institutions around the globe. You can check him out at thawara.com. He's the author of over 8 books, and I'm really delighted that he can be with us. So welcome, Brian.
Well, welcome, and again, thank you so much for having us here on such short notice. Van, this has been wonderful to see the community gathered to celebrate poetry, arts, and literature here. And so, I think one of the important parts about this whole era has been learning how to appreciate how we recognize time, memories, what we give space to in our lives. Ben, so I'm going to read to you a couple of pieces from some newer books of mine, as well as some books that recently turned 15 years old, and I'm left wondering, where did that time go? But from my 2020 collection, Before We Remember, We Dream, here's the poem Ironies. After 30 years of poetry, I learned at least 100 words in no less than 2 tongues, unique to our journey as refugees, to fill vacuums and bloody gaps of our disrupted histories. Recovering families, dismantling enemies, identifying the official tools of allies bombing us for our own good, their policies of destruction and resettlement, how to win hearts and minds in diaspora, from DC to Modesto, Anchorage to the Twin Cities, walking into 1,000 classrooms, strangers to the beauty of Vinchan, Savanaket, a heartfelt Sabide, gathering ink storm clouds to change worlds. One poem still can't tell my whole story. This was the opening poem to my collection On the Other Side of the Eye, way back in 2007. What kills a man? Always small things, around, holes, fumes, edges, a second, a footstep, a sip, a bite, a word, a cell, a motion, an emotion, a dream, a fool, a bit of salt, a drop, a fragment, the true root of arguments. What kills a man is mysterious only in how minute the culprit behind the blow. We're careless and we forget. Even when what kills a man is another man, it is a small thing that kills a man. The whole earth, a single grain, on a sprawling table filled with the smallest things. Because so many of us are working on, freelance jobs and gigs out there. Here's a poem from my collection called Contracting. One morning over coffee, we were discussing terms, negotiating with a bit of levity the hue of a French postcard and an American biscotti. I mentioned casually, we say in the industry you can get it good, fast, or cheap, but you can't have all three. Pick two. With a wry smile, he takes a sip of his hot macchiato. That's a good one. In my family, we say you can get people who are obedient, smart, or loyal. Pick two. I suppose we all know what that got everyone. We shake hands, and I return to a world of ink, rife with all their uncertainties. We often talk about it in my classes with my fellow students and about the nature of my bringing English into the American world of arts and letters here. And this is the poem that kind of explains it from my 2013 collection, Demonstra. Passa Falang. En route to our cafe rendezvous on University Avenue, debating sushi, pho, or nachos, everything bagels or decadent croissants, famished literary ninjas crammed in a car, or were we Roman gun-ho samurai? Pondering our ink-filled avatars, the verbose madam from Phnom Penh, who loves to sing, Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto, and every stanza of Bohemian Rhapsody at karaoke reminds me, Sabaydi will always be a foreign word. Aloha, America, of thee I sing. One of the projects I've been working on recently has been marking the 40th anniversary of the death of the Asian American man Vincent Chin in Detroit, Michigan. And this was the poem Ypsilanti, 1982. In 36 years, I barely spared a word about my days in Ypsilanti, known chiefly for giving us Iggy Pop and an obscure pioneer in continental drift. I was watching the 9 o'clock news with my father in our living room, as was the family habit. I was 9. Eating a baby Ruth in June when a picture of Vincent Chin flashed on screen with a discussion of murder, Japan, and the Motor City. My father said not to take it personally. We were going to have a barbecue with our blue-collar neighbor on Saturday, once he was done at the Ford factory. Our other neighbor across the way, with the tall, bottle-blonde daughters, was a Baptist preacher, fond of discussing Pearl Harbor with me every other day, because I couldn't tell him a thing about Laos. Next year marks the 50th anniversary since the end of the secret bombing of Laos, a conflict that left over 30% of our countryside contaminated with unexploded weapons built in Minnesota and across the United States almost 50 years later. Back in 2003, I made my first trip back to Laos in 30 years, and this poem, Babylon Gallery, was part of the result. Babylon Gallery. She brought the gray spoon we hung upon the gallery wall from the Talat stalls in downtown Ponsavan. She was supposed to be collecting Daneng, folk tales, and we were showing off art we were so certain would change the way the world sees that stumbled elephant we rode in on. She was an indelicate work, this Buon, a light cockatrice feather, crude malice her center, her bowl an echo of bomb craters, whispering mad as Gorgon. They dine with spoons like this all over there, we're informed. Hammered from war scraps the dogs find indigestible. They sold me this one, certain it's American bullets at the core. It was time, they said, we took them back. I pondered how many startled people this carnivorous spoon passed through in her previous incarnations, karma denying her a role in the finer flatware set for the saints. Oddly, for as many threads as she cut short, she was too weak to be the butter knife she should have been. Swords into plowshares, someone scribbled casually in a comment card. One of many remarks, disposable as plastic sporks. And finally, I'll close with the poem, What is the Southeast Asian American Poem of Tomorrow, which first appeared in Angry Asian Man years and years ago. What is the Southeast Asian American Poem of Tomorrow? It is not hip-hop, despite some hopes. It is not slam. It is not even an anti-poem. It is not the form of old Europeans or the resurrected ghazal. The author's words, I must inform you, would not even resemble or recall the old Gzir, Gadao, or the... Much to our parents' regrets, who pray among vats and steeples for good grandchildren, lucky numbers, and doctors in the family. If our lovely readers do not grow free, we would be unreadable. If our writing is too predictable, we will lie in the ditches unsold. If our words don't speak what's in our souls and skulls, we will forget ourselves, our bodies, our shapes, our language. And the true shape of a Southeast Asian American poem of tomorrow will become an exercise in modern myth. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for participating in today's reading. I'm Brian Powell, and I look forward to seeing all of you again in the future.
And who's our interloper? What's the name of the cat, Brian?
Oh, this is our interloper, Arch, who has become my poet's assistant as of last month or so, and he is quite
all right,
precocious, Bear, and you'll be seeing more of him in the years ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian. Welcome, everyone. Those of you that are just joining us, again, this is Isobreak, the APWT New York Writers Workshop co-production. I just wanted to share, I mentioned to folks that the conference is coming up and live in person. And so you can actually find details. Let me see if I can... Okay. I don't know if everyone... Oh, that's not it. Oh, well, if you look at apwriters.org, you can find details. The early bird registration has been extended until the end of the weekend, and it is, I like to say, a much more intimate version of AWP, the conference some of you know, that has a much more diverse group of translators, poets, writers, agents, publishers, academics from Asia and beyond. Certainly open to anyone at all. So we are about halfway through, and I'm glad now to introduce another old friend, a fellow member of Matwala, a South Asian literary organization. Zilka Joseph was born in Mumbai, lived in Kolkata, and she is now in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and her work reflects her both Indian and Bene Israel roots, as well as Western cultures. She's published 5 collections of books, been nominated for awards or won awards from PEN America, the Pushcart, the Best Indie Book Awards. She was awarded a Zell Fellowship and the Michael R. Gutterman Award from the University of Michigan. And she has a new book out, In Our Beautiful Bones. It was a Forward Indies Award finalist, is nominated for several other awards. And she teaches creative writing, advises manuscripts, and is a mentor to many writers. You can find out more about her work at zilkajoseph.com. Thank you so much for being with us, Zilka. Welcome.
Hi, Ravi. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here. I just feel so privileged to be in this wonderful, wonderful company. As Ravi read my bio, you probably got a sense of how varied my background is. And I often tell people that I've lived many lives because I've been in so many different parts of not just, I won't say parts of the world, but I've had so many varied experiences because of my background. And so my writing reflects many religions, many mythologies, different cultures. And I know many of you don't know, perhaps don't know much about who the Ben Israel are. We are a very ancient community of Jews that first arrived in India on the West Coast in roughly 2000 BC. There are many, many theories about our arrival, but one of them is that two ships were wrecked in a storm on the west coast of India. So one of the poems I'll be reading refers to that origin. And as Ravi mentioned, my newest book is in our beautiful bones, but I was very fortunate last year to have Sparrows and Dust, a chapbook that also won an award recently, the Best Indie Book Award. And I'm going to read mainly from In Our Beautiful Bones. And since we were talking about covers, I really wanted to show you this beautiful, beautiful cover that is a part of a painting by Siona Benjamin, who is also a Ben Israeli artist who lives in the US, in New Jersey. So I kind of bought this for this book. So all right, so let me get to reading. The very first poem I'm going to read is a poem that sets the tone for this book, In Our Beautiful Bones, which is partly about my journey to the US, experiences in racism, otherism, and all the good stuff that goes with being an immigrant. And it also gives a history of colonialism, the history of the British in India. So I'm going to read little bits of that. But my first poem is called Voyage. And the epigraph reads, the Upanishads explain how wisdom can be absorbed through sound, how the ear is a vessel, the receiver of divine messages. The lightning fell, and I only knew that it entered my eyes, and thunder repeated words in my ears I could not understand. In the gray blue light of evening, a sheet of silver drew itself like a shroud over my car, its engine an animal thrashing in the hold, my heartbeat like oars slamming hard against every climbing wave, my hands on the steering wheel clawing as if it were a raft. At 16, my father sailed the Bombay steamships, nearly deafened by their sound. Gales, ice sent Elmo's fire striking on the high seas, then sailed diesel vessels through squalls when the sky was black and the water black, and the sailors' hearts shrunk from fear, all listening on deck and on the bridge and in the bowels of the engine room to what the thunder said. And turning into a vacant lot on Opdyke near Pontiac, the storm washed me clean off the road. Wipers swept leaves and yellow-black sky into sea foam. I watched the windshield bulge like a goatskin. It strained but held. Then a dam of light broke, the wall of water shattering its cargo, and me inside it, like a seed giving itself up to water and to wind. In the west, sunlight crashing in the broken branches of oaks burned a tunnel of sienna through which the bow of my ship rose to meet the horizon, and my father, the chief, roared to his engineers, their faces streaked with oil and boiler suits, sweat drenched. Men whose torn lips bled as another peal shook the flailing vessel, and we turned our faces to the upper deck. Like our Jewish ancestors wrecked on the Konkan coast thousands of years ago, we waited, but no calm came until the wind suddenly fell. My car almost shoved onto its side, now only swayed. A metal cradle spat from the mouth of thunder. I smelled its breath. Its teeth left bloodless marks on my skin. My bones shook, and though it was gone, I felt its pull, a lift, a nameless terror, and my deafened ears received every word it said, what it had said to my ancestors, what it had said to my father and to his men, as it had let the sailors go, as it had let my father go, and let us all go home. So that's the opening poem, Voyage, that sets the tone for all the other journeys in the book. The next poem I'm going to read is called Hunting White Tigers in Kipling Country. And if you have traveled in India, you will know there are various national parks which were started as Project Tiger to conserve and save tigers. But Kipling Country, of course, Rudyard Kipling was part of this whole area of Madhya Pradesh, India. But the kings of that area, which is the Scindia family, mostly they had a belief that when they went, the king or the prince had to kill at least 101 tigers to actually receive the blessing of the gods. So this is a take on that, as well as the British Raj in India. Hunting white tigers in Kipling Country, Madhya Pradesh, India. To the Indian kings, the royal shikaris, hunting came as naturally as ownership of kingdom. And the killing of tigers, especially 101 white tigers in one lifetime. May the gods preserve and keep the kingly race. The blood of tigers giving long life and many sons was considered auspicious. From father to son, son to father, the game rooms grew through the length of palaces modeled on Versailles, filled with striped and spotted pelts, horned trophies, and sometimes one single black and white photograph of a grand old hunt stretched from wall to palace wall. Soon the Rajas invited white sahibs on shikar too, hoping manly camaraderie with the ruling race. Long live and cheers to the gin and tonic, the soft tones of sunlight on the enormous verandas, the reshmi kebabs served by turbaned servants would buy them, help spare their hunting grounds. With fanfare and guns, they would set out, but only after thousands of villagers set out at dawn, beat drums, combed bristling jungles, till tigers leapt from cover and dashed madly towards the wall of elephants, from whose backs the bejeweled rajas and sola topied sahibs thundered a monsoon of bullets, felling every creature that fled toward them. Perhaps some birds escaped through storm of dust, blood, and death roars. But to ensure continuance of blessing and bounty at the hands of mighty gods and the mightier British, oh, how the sun never set in those kingdoms. The hunt went on till 101 white tigers, maybe even a few less Bengals, leopards, sloth bear, wild dog, and cat, deer, hare, boar, antelope, and bison were dragged by loyal subjects. And who can name these humble natives, their children's, their mortal terrors, who laid them side by side in a never ending road? And what was the length of those sepia tinted hunt room photographs from sunrise to sunset? Turn your head from the wall on the east to the wall on the west. Inhale the mothball and brimstone smell. Witness the blood blasted fur. Count each black and white stripe. Count every color. Count as they mark the mud with their sprawled bodies. Drawn claws, now sheets, become one long red carpet in the dust. And the last poem I'm going to read is called A to Z of Foreign Anguish. And this poem is an Abecedarian, and many of you know the Abecedarian really goes back to the time of Chaucer, so it's not anything new. But in America, there is a great love for this form. And I've tried to up the game a little bit in this poem because I've written it as a double Abecedarian, which means it not only starts with the letter, with the first sentence not only starts with the letter A, but it ends with the letter A, and each following sentence is B and B and C and C. So there's a play on all of that. And this poem is modeled after a Nosebe Philip poem that many of you probably know, and and recognize. It's called The Discourse on the Logic of Language. And if you haven't heard her read this poem, I highly recommend you do that. It's mesmerizing and it's heartbreaking. So here goes. A to Z of Foreign Anguish. A is for anguish, says my mummy tongue, my lingo, la la la. But English is my foreign father tongue, daddy lang, blab blab blab. Colonists with your white gaze told our stories with classic demagoguery, tyranny, manifest destiny, excuses. You forged evil tales to transform us into demons, crushed truths with vile, flippant lies. What about us? How you ravaged us? Scepter and staff grind down our culture. Kings of erosion and erasure, how long has your terror ruled? Your knives at our children's throats? Who wash Indians out of every picture? Who conquered our lands crying, I just come in peace? And guns in your hearts, greed in your DNA. The Raj kept us slaves in our own land, took our tea, spices, jewels, broke our back, lashed and tortured us. What's in your crown? Our Kohinoor. Oh, cruel masters, recorders of the inferior race, ah, clever Sahib and Mame, natives, like insects you labeled us with fine calipers, condescension. Oppressor, the nightmare still lives, the hate systems that never go. Pain is embedded in our bones. You poisoned our wells. Now you dump questions on us. You teach us civility. Listen to our Q&A, our A and Q right out of our mouths. You shove the father tongue down our savage and shithole countries' throats. Destroyed histories, literatures, tongues. Made us ugly in our own eyes, made us hate ourselves, split us, shattered us, turned Hindu against Muslim, Muslim against Hindu. Viceroys and priests, you ruled, you hunger converted us. O holy reverend white man, was sweet Jesus's face fair? He was a humble dark-skinned Jew. Xanax, will it help? When we invite you to our open table, you vex yourself. You cry, wear your current foreign anguish. Then we can sway zeitgeist word biz karma. Got heart? Got English? Chutzpah? Pizzazz? Thank you so much. Thanks, Ravi, for having me, and to all of you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ilka. That is one I want to see on the page. Remarkable, double abecedarian. Welcome, everyone. We're halfway through another remarkable Isobreak. I'm Ravi Shankar. It's an Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop co-production. And I think I have figured out how to share this screen. Here we go. So those of you who are interested, this is the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators Conference happening November 28th to 30th. It is both a creative and academic conference, so if you're able to get funding, there you can put in any proposal that you like. And it is really, as I mentioned, a wonderful organization. All right, so let us continue. We have two more readers, and then we'll have a conversation. What a fascinating group of voices we've had so far. And I'm really pleased to welcome my old friend, Ben Grossberg, who works as the Director of Creative Writing at the University of Hartford. His latest book of poems just came out last year, My Husband Would, won the 2021 Connecticut Book Awards. His other books include Space Traveler and Sweet Core Orchard, which was the winner of the 2009 Lambda Literary Award for Poetry. This fall, he's going to be a festival poet in the Dodge Poetry Festival and coming to us from Connecticut. Welcome, Ben. Nice to have you. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Ravi. And thanks to the other readers. So far, it's just been wonderful to hear your work. I'm going to begin with a couple of poems from the book that Ravi mentioned, My Husband Would, my most recent book of poems. Let's see. So the first poem I'm going to read is called Days of 1993, 94, and 95. It's a short poem. The title is a play on Konstantin Cavafy's Days of poems, in which he remembers a youth alive with sensual encounters with other men, and the poems are sort of delicious and melancholy. And so reading that poem made me think, well, you know, what if I were going to write a poem reminiscing about my youth? So this poem is set in the Montrose Clinic, Houston, and the poem describes it a little. And the poem also describes, some of you may remember, the process for getting an HIV test back in the early 90s, which was not nearly as convenient as it is now. Days of 1993, 94, and 95. Timing, the lag. You couldn't know. Well, you could. The slip in your wallet, the gravel lot, a trailer, weeds, no sign, your blood drawn up, stoppered, a cotton ball blot, band-aided to your forearm. You could. You could match numbers on test tube and slip, return in 2 weeks, wait 3 months. The lag, more blood, new slip. You careful, are you? Good. Or learn what? Discipline, to take yourself in hand. Not so hard, right? But look, you're back in that chair, forearms slung forward, damned with a purple band, new slip crammed in your pocket, thinking where, how it might have gotten in, that tainted cell, and wondering who you could and couldn't tell. So one more poem from this book. This poem was called Grandmother at the Stove. And my hope is to sort of make a kind of juxtaposition, thinking about things we came through in our youth that we're not sure how we came through. Grandmother at the Stove. She strikes a diamond on the box. It flares, and when it nears the jet, a burst of blue engulfs her hand. Seems to. But unaware, she lets her hand linger, the match aglow within the jet, bright as a tiny star. Now she withdraws the hand, shaking, slow, unfazed, and holds the match aloft in air, then leans in close, face, lips pursed to blow. The nub flickering, her forefinger and thumb look like a wick, as if the fire had sprung from her breath and she could carry it, numb and wielding. At her knee, I watch, too young to know she's come through 3 wars unburned. What it means to handle fire, how she learned. Okay, so that's all for that book. I'm going to read some newer poems now. My mother, may she rest in peace, died a few years ago. So obviously, you know, that's something one often writes about. So I'm going to read a couple of poems about my mother's passing. This first poem is called The Wedgwood, the Watches. Wedgwood didn't matter, my mother says, speaking to me in a dream. The little vases and ashtrays, the boxes littering the house, I ask. They didn't matter? No, she says, swirling ice cubes in a tumbler of vodka. No, though haggling for them at yard sales, watching people wrap them in newspaper, then shoving them so wrapped into my purse, that mattered. She takes a drag on her cigarette like she used to at bingo when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and she sat across from me smoking cigarette after cigarette to the drone of numbers in a hall so dense with smoke you couldn't make out blue hairs 5 seats away. What about watches, I ask, knowing my mother's predilection for watches. A Hamilton, she'd cry, a Seiko, it still works, winding its gear between the long nails of her thumb and forefinger and thrusting it right up against the side of my head so I could hear the tick. Watches, she says now, so ghostly in my dream that she flickers as hazy and insubstantial as cigarette smoke. Smoke, generating smoke. Didn't mean shit, she says, slicing the air with the edge of her palm like she did when she was alive, her face, her jaw set firm. But showing Dad the watch after I came home from the auction, holding it out and watching for the tick to register in your eyes, that, she says. Then she mentions Dad, how he'd snatch the watch from her hand and hold it up high and say, it ticks, she got a real bargain, a real Matsia, a Hamilton that ticks. Then he'd parade around the kitchen a little, do a kind of strut, and she would grab the watch back from his hand and strap it on her wrist and wear it the rest of the day and say, I know, as if there wasn't any irony in his pronouncement, and who knows, maybe there wasn't. That, she says, mattered. And now, because it's a dream, she grabs my wrist and zap, we're in the house where he still lives, watching him bend over a drawer with 9 or 10 Seikos and Hamiltons, with his forefinger stirring them around as if they were morsels of frying meat. He's speaking in a low voice. She liked watches, your mother. So I ask her, if the watches don't matter, but this matters, doesn't that mean the watches matter? She swirls her tumbler, and we look up from the kitchen counter at my dad, who continues explaining about the watches. But soon all we hear is the ticking of out-of-sync gears. Tick, tick, tick. Okay. One more poem about my mother. This poem is called My Mother Approves. It was not evening out jewelry, not twice a year jewelry. She slept in it. She always said when she died, I would have it, but almost certainly never pictured me wearing it. How it would lie an inch below my beard in the hollow between my clavicles. How the serpentine chain would catch stray hairs on my shoulders and neck, and the emerald, bright with its corona of diamond chips, would fill the open collar of a flannel shirt over jeans, brown belt, work boots, and be, to the right kind of man, a signal, a traffic light glowing green at the most vulnerable spot on my throat. Now in death, she understands the necklace was always about drawing the eye to the flesh, a way to scoop light from the air to make a man want to catch that light like a snowflake on his tongue. Yes, that's the word she's saying to the body most like her own once was, briefly incarnating herself in front of me to straighten the chain. My mother, like any mother, willing her child to be beautiful. Yes, it fits like that, close to the throat. Thank you.
Great. Wow. Really powerful elegies, Ben. Thank you so much. Those of you that are just joining us, we have one more reader. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is Isobreak. Really, what a profound range of readings we've had today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And our final reader of the afternoon, evening is Cynthia Dewi Oka, who's originally from Bali, Indonesia, and the author of The Fire's Not a Country and Salvage, both from Northwestern University Press, and Nomad of Salt and Hard Water from Threadmake's Blanket Press. She's a recipient of the Amy Clampett Residency, Tupelo Quarterly Poetry Prize, and her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, in Oprah Daily Poetry, the Academy of American Poets, Guernica, and more. She taught creative writing at Bryn Mawr at New Mexico State University and Voices of Our Nation, VONA, and worked as an organizer, a trainer, and a fundraiser in social movements for gender, racial, economic, and migrant justice. And her poems about migrancy are really quite stunning, I think. And her fourth collection of poetry is just about to come out. Tinderbox in 3 acts is a Blessing the Boat selection and will be out in October from Boa Editions. And maybe we'll hear a poem from that. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ravi. And thank you, Oka, Brian, Zilka, and Benjamin. Your poems were so electrifying. Thank you. I'm actually just going to read poems from Tinderbox today. And this is the book. It's so pretty. I really just want to shout out Sandy Knight at Boa Editions for creating such a beautiful design. They're orchids, and the book deals with the 1965 anti-communist genocide in Indonesia, which remains taboo to many extents especially amongst Indonesians. And orchids symbolize everlasting love for the dead. I try not to confuse cruelty with power. I try not to mistake dogma for solidarity. I try to cook a balanced meal for my family with carbs, bright vegetables, and salmon. I try to exercise. I try to be patient I try to answer my son's questions to help him climb over the wall. I try to quit smoking. I try to speak different languages. I try to come up with a winning strategy. I try to wrap syntax around my life. I try classical music. I try Beyonce. I try like a cat to land on my feet. I try banging pots and pans. I try rallies. I try saying things like, not my president, but since I couldn't vote as an immigrant, the president really isn't my president. So it's a bit like saying the rain is wet. I try to arrive on time. I try to meet most of the requirements. I try making amends. I try poems, then not poems. Against all these efforts, absence stands. Apologia. On earth, I have mistaken a rock for a voice for a listening, with my shovel by the sea, with the long shadows of fishermen hauling living diamonds out of the water, the air itself green. A man beat me while a woman watched, crossing her wrists. Then I learned to think in your language. Went door knocking, wasting good cloth on banners that kept nobody warm. I made shells out of unstable electricity, flew a long way to catalog the wedding dresses jets leave in the sky. In a theater without hands. I would have liked to fall asleep being held, but held vigil instead for the kites that tugged free of their children. Under the night sand, I gave names to unsinging bones, found in my body as though I were made of a historical material. I tried to contain them, like a capitalist donning felt hats on the decapitated, and American gum to stick to a wall the letters announcing democracy, like a cool band. My parents were essentially reasonable people keeping themselves curtained, then a piece of paper posed as a door. An aunt visiting the Pacific Northwest for the first time after a 20-hour flight said to no one in particular, "Your streets are so clean. There are no ghosts here. I too have difficulty separating one love from another. Is it true Suharto was a hero? My mother asked. In English, I have found survival both a literary fetish and socially awkward. The truth is, I called myself comrade because it was convenient to adapt rules for revolutionary behavior from Ecclesiastes. Like anywhere on earth, the flip side of a hill is a hole. My shovel makes the rock sleep. Open, it says, with its stern and painted edge. Math in the Post-Colony, Yogyakarta, December 1965. And this is spoken in this poem is in the voice of one of the personas in the book. If the Brits, Dutch, Japs did, why not the Dun too? Restless, I watched a red ball sink into the harbor with difficulty at first. The body is logistically tougher than you think. It pleads like it could have been a son instead of a hen. I had to command myself. I vomited with rock in my left, machete in my right, until I chapped. But then it was like any other labor wringing from my hands, drowning the idle truck's confessions. I sleep fine on my jasmine-scented pillow, a king-shaped serenity in the fore of a vowel kicking for its life. You can't tell me how many flies I drove to the water. The headlights, the water stone-faced, twinkling like medallions. Still, there is worship left in this land. Since before I was born, I could perform a simple division. And this is in the voice of another persona. The Sound of Music, Denpasar, February 1989. Everything, even the Von Traps, comes late to this polluted land. I mean, all night the stray dogs bay, the air explodes with worthless applause. Last night I pulled teeth rotted black out of a 7-year-old girl. Her belly was worm-taut. It made me think of the child wriggling inside my wife. How her feet crack like rivers 6 months of the year, how thin the membranes are inside her. I know how to keep my head in the new order, but watching her watch Maria spin on a living hill, I want to offer her neck a scrubbed blue sky, lace it with lake-feathered geese. Some nights I wake to brine pouring out of my pores. It's the same every time. 4-blade spinning, a fence of people tall in black coats. Where are the mosquitoes? What does the nun say? A dream that will need all the love you can give. We buried our first child under the frangipani in the yard, whose petals are a version of snow. I am trying to decide what I can and cannot say to myself. For instance, the web holds the blue-backed fly like an unsung note. Today is not always to die. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Olka. Wonderful. And that brings us to the end of the reading portion of our event, but we're going to have a little conversation, and I see that people have been making a few comments. And I'm going to bring everyone back on screen. Again, those of you that are just joining us, this has been Isobreak 19, APWT New York Writers Workshop joint production. And I found it fascinating hearing everyone's work, and maybe we can start here because there were these interesting connections. I think that we have ranged over science and history and different forms. And I wanted to start with this idea because I know a couple of poets here work in this mode of science fiction, or I suppose as it's called, speculative fiction, and its marriage to poetry. And I know Brian is the president of this organization. We were talking before we went live about some of the utility of what I think now has become a pretty well-sanctioned genre. I mean, Ursula Le Guin and others are being taught as serious literature. There never should have been a question about that. But Brian, do you want to start and maybe talk a little bit about the organization and what that mode does for you? I mean, to work metaphorically in the world of the speculative?
Absolutely. I mean, I think right now the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association now has over 400 members in 19 countries around the globe. And we were established back in 1978. So next year will be the 45th anniversary, in which we had taken it upon ourselves to recognize poets who are continuing what is ultimately longitudinally a grand tradition of looking back at our myths, our imagination, and giving value to that and how it might speak to us and to reach towards these deeper truths. So in many ways, the science fiction component came from the idea that science, and let alone the way that we incorporate science into our prose, is still a relatively new phenomenon in the grand scheme of human conversations and literature. And so this is actually fun to be able to be a part of new territory. Ben, like how are we integrating and incorporating technology? Where do we see ourselves? Like this year is the anniversary of a film called Blade Runner, where it talks about being more human than human. What does it mean when you have to actually have these tests, which test whether or not are you a human or are you a robot? Because as we see with artificial intelligence making all the incredible art, for example, some of it poetry, some of it visual art. And you almost can't tell the difference. Who made this? What does that mean for us? So, poetry goes on in that direction, but we're also still asking some of the same questions that we asked in the poetry of the Odyssey, the Iliad, Beowulf. Let's see, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, for example, created the very transgressive idea that you could have an American literature. Remember, before Edgar Allan Poe came on, whether or not you like the cadence of "Once Upon a Midnight Dreary," as I pondered, weak and weary, you have to remember that we were only thinking that poetry could only be done in the English style or the Italian style, maybe the French style. But now it's like that paved the way for an entire body of American literature. So these are the conversations that we have, and that for those of us in the diaspora, for the Southeast Asian culture, we look at Paradise Lost, for example. Milton survived the English Civil War, and he found, right after the English Civil War, that all the things that he wanted to talk about, we didn't have words for that. And also, it was very sensitive to talk about who did what to who. Back then, you couldn't call out people like you were calling it out in Dante's Inferno. Then saying this person's going to be punished in this layer of hell. So right. So then the question is that
Yeah, so you're kind of sweeping along a lot of classical reference in what is a really kind of futuristic genre. And I kind of feel like, Ben, you were working in a slightly different mode. And I don't know if you were consciously trying in Space Traveler to kind of abide in this kind of new genre, or if it seemed to be the perfect metaphor for someone who's a little estranged from his life. I mean, I was lucky enough to see some of those poems in draft form, but it became in almost a conceit for the entire book. What were you thinking about?
I mean, absolutely. There's great metaphorical possibility, and I guess that to me gets to what I love about science fiction. I think about the essential work that we do as poets is to make the familiar strange so we can see it again. right? Because I mean, that's what it means for something to be cliche, is we have seen it so much we cease to see it. And science fiction seems to me to be like a hugely effective like method of causing reseeing, because you know, other creatures, other planets, other worlds, other intelligences come in contact with the human for the first time, and just as they much register, you know, I think about this with cats. You know, we just saw Brian's adorable cat, and if you're not a cat, cat behaviors, you know, they have a lot of commonalities. My friend, when I first got a cat, a good friend of mine, you know, hey, my cat, his response was, well, they all do that. Hey, it jumped on my lap. It slept on my leg. They all do that. And if you're not a human, you can look at humans and say, yeah, they all do that. You know, the behaviors become more obvious. So for me, not only was it a metaphor for estrangement, it was also a way to look back on humanity, not as a human, and to say, what really is there? What is essential? And then, of course, I think Brian sort of got to this when he was talking about Milton. I think of Spencer as well. You know, that there's not much better for engaging the imagination. You know, for reimagining from the ground up. And in that way, I actually think of those classical writers, you know, Milton's Satan's Journey Out of Hell, right? Like that's a scene right out of Star Trek. I mean, you know, like this stuff is inspiring to us just as it was to them, only we have other fields to play in, right? The fields up there, not just the fields back there, you know, space, not just the past and myth.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about, Ostrany, as the Russian dramatist Victor Shklovsky told it, right? I mean, making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I also think of that great poem by Craig Rain, The Martian Sends a Postcard Home. Well, kind of moving from science fiction to science, Oka, when I was reading a lot of your work, I noticed this infusion of all kinds of different science, from the biological to the neurocognitive. Can you talk a bit about that? And I don't know if you work in the speculative genre, but certainly I see the influence of science in your work.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I was part of this anthology, Uncanny Magazine's Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. If you want to look at, yeah, if you want to look at a bunch of disabled people destroying science fiction. So and firstly, I want to thank you all for your wonderful readings, and it's just really wonderful to realize again and again through poetry that you're not the only person obsessed with variously mothers, tigers, Southeast Asian colonial histories. You know, like there's so many of us out there. So thank you for making us seem less alone. Yeah. So I think I'm really fascinated by systems of knowledge, and I find sort of Western sciences rather peculiar sometimes, and sort of how, okay, these are the Latin words for these animals now that, you know, indigenous cultures have had names and knowledge systems for forever. I wrote an article a while ago called The Grammar of Time Travel, because Indonesian doesn't have past, present, future tenses. So to me, as a translator especially, I see all Indonesian translations into English as science fiction, because they're all speculative, because of, like, they're fixing tenses, but really the same sentence could be past, present, and futuristic as well. So I kind of see every sort of translation into English of Indonesian as science fiction, and I'm really interested in learning how other languages could perhaps locate the speculative in the English as well. And I think that I think especially when we're so often taught to sort of pathologize our bodies, whether as women, disabled people, people of color, migrants, you know, our bodies are so often pathologized. I think there's something interesting about playing with that tension of using scientific taxonomy or categories, but very much locating it in the corporeal, and the fact that, you know, you can't quantify souls, and that's what this poetry stuff is all about, you know. So I like playing with tensions between ways of perceiving scientific phenomena that could be considered speculative, I guess.
Oh, great answer. Thank you. And Cynthia, do you want to respond to that? And I'm really curious. I mean, you have this great poem in poetry, Manifest, where you talk about the migrant feminist. And I feel like some of those tropes are a little bit speculative and certainly pushing the bounds of literary realism. Does that, and I'm also curious, I wanted to hear from both Oka and Cynthia about Indonesia, which is for many of our readers, and I know we'll have readers in Australia and India and others who will wake up and watch this later. So greetings to all of you. But I think a lot of people don't know much about Indonesia, though it's a country of 275 million and the largest Islamic country, though Bali is a Hindu place. I mean, there's a lot of politics in your work as well. So do you want to speak to either of those modes, Cynthia?
Yeah, I think I want to jump off something that Oka was saying around science. I mean, what is science? Science is a process by which we decide what is true, right? And it's like and before that we had religion, and then alongside science we also have ideology. So it's like science is just one of these modes that I think of as like, this is how humans in finding ourselves existing on this planet and not knowing how to explain our own existence and what are we going to do with ourselves, like we create these systems for making decisions essentially, right? So I think when I think about science that way, I sort of like, what is its root motivation? Like, what is its reason for being? I think often about how memory, like what is more speculative than memory? If we're going to put the fiction to science, like science fiction, because we're constantly revising our memories, like as individuals, as families, as nations. Like if anything, it's, what is a social movement? A social movement begins with the process of revising memory. Like, what are we going to hold? What is the kind of information we're going to admit into the ledger? And therefore, what does that mean about who we are and what is possible for us? So I also think about like, I love what you were saying earlier about Brian, about what does it mean to like fight to be part of this like futurizing project, right? And I think it's like it's a both and, because as long as we are only dealing with like this amount of information, then that is the future that we're going to be able to see. And so I think part of the work is, and it's actually kind of ties to like what Oka was saying around tense. I think there's something to learn from the Indonesian mode here of everything being everywhere all at once. Definitely go see that movie. But like, if we can do that, then like, what are all of the pathways that become possible? And like, how is it that we can help each other and support each other as not just a literary community, but I'm also thinking about, those particularly in English or like in the West that get represented as like voiceless or like powerless or like whatever. And, there's like no one louder than like my aunties. Because my aunties are like the least voiceless people I know. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, you can always take being listened to for granted. So I think there's this kind of like expansion of listening also that we have to fight for in this moment. So I think in terms of like thinking around, speculation, definitely, and surrealism, absurdist modes have always been like a really big part of my work. As a result of that, I think because it is sometimes, I think for a very long time, being like the only Indonesian poet I knew meant that even thinking that someone would read me or read my work, or that my work was going to meet anything but the ether, had to be a speculative exercise. It had to be like, I had to embrace the absurdism of trying to be a poet. Like out here, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that there's something about science fiction. It makes sense that it would be something that marginalized communities could use to convey some kind of new message. I recently saw an exhibit of Ellen Gallagher. I don't know if people know that Afrofuturist artist who Terrence Hayes has written about. And it's really such rich work. And I also live in Providence, where there's the H.P. Lovecraft House, who was just such a kind of notorious racist and didn't really want writers of color. And so, but you mentioned something, Cynthia, and I want to bring this to Zilka, that nothing is more speculative than memory. And I felt like, Zilka, in your work and in some of your new work, some poems I hadn't heard before, there is this kind of rich tapestry of history, of colonial history that you're delving into. Do you want to kind of speak to that?
Sure, sure. Thank you all. It's just been wonderful. I just learned so much from all of you. And yes, absolutely. I think, whenever we are dealing with memory in any way, there's so much of imagination that goes into the writing of those memories, because there's some things that you remember the red color of my mother's sari, or the blue flower by the table. But then so much of it, the emotion of it and all of that, also comes so much from what you think you remember. So we are weaving in, and I think I would just call it imagination rather than the speculative aspect of it, because so much of my work is storytelling. So much of my work is bringing back my stories from my childhood, my parents who have passed, and with the background of all these histories. So if I read a poem in a workshop here somewhere, so much of the context I have to somehow weave into the poem as well, so that I can bring in the history, the mythology, and the personal story that I want to present. So sometimes it's very challenging, because I want people to have a way to get into my story, but I also want them to realize how complex these histories are. So I have poems in this book, a poem called English as She Is Spoke. And the whole poem is about how people comment on the English you speak and the English you write. And then when you go, you're in a workshop somewhere, somebody comments on how colonial your language is. Or when you get a job teaching English, somebody says, "Oh, aren't you pleased, like, you were colonized," or something like that. So there's a great mixture and texture going on in a lot of my poems here, where how do you talk about yourself, without bringing in these histories, without bringing memory, without bringing mythology. I've more recently started to talk about my Ben Israel history, because wherever you go, there's a sense that everybody's Ashkenazi. That's not true. We have huge, 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 huge Jewish cultures all over the world. So I've begun to talk a little bit more about that. And a lot of my writing had it before. And people would say, "Oh, Jewish, there are Jews in India." So then I have a poem in this book about the first line being, "Oh, there are Jews in India." And so I play off that. So memory, history, mythology, so much of it is trying to allow people to see that we're not just one dimensional. There's so much. So part of that becomes the speculative aspect, this imaginative aspect that you bring in to build your stories and allow people a glimpse into who you really are, or at least try to say, "Hey, there are other people out there, with stories of their own." Very
Brian, were you going to
powerful
respond
ones.
to that?
Sorry?
Oh, I looked like Brian wanted to
Oh,
respond.
Brian, go ahead.
I think you're muted. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I was going to say, right? That was one of the interesting things that I try not to be too self-conscious about it when I was making my first book. For example, 15 years ago, then, about the idea that, looking at the American publishing market, I kind of knew what kind of books of poetry, what kind of stories we had seen before that publishers would most likely want to do. And so then I had to become very self-conscious about making that choice of, being one of the first Lao American poets who is going to be writing a book out there. We could do, it's like that stereotype, cliche idea of, my 10,000 days of the August peonies and the chrysanthemum, river by the swollen Mekong, flight from danger or whatever, you wanted to call it.
Did you feel, Brian, extra pressure that you had to somehow be representative or that you had to speak on behalf of because you were one of the first?
Absolutely. And then the question was that I decided that, well, we could do that, but it was far more important to me to say, okay, no, we're going to turn left. We're going to go in a completely opposite direction, and we're going to try and liberate our community's opportunities then by saying, okay, no, that's like, one of our very first books of major poetry then after the course of the Vietnam War was now going to be, no, we're going to talk to you about science fiction. And maybe someone will come after me who says, well, if I don't have to write about a memoir about my family's journey and the conflict between old country and new country, well, if you can write about science fiction, I can write about soccer, or I can write about breakdancing, or I can write about anything then. And that was the thing that as we choose these books for ourselves, then I think in what we create, it will become so much more important to give people the bravery to say, you often hear, in our classrooms, like, oh, you have to write about the serious stuff, the serious literature, your most important story to tell. And I get where that comes from. But I think that more than ever, we actually do need to also start creating a barrier to say, well, we can talk about that. But at the same time, if I want to just simply talk about a day going down the street in my neighborhood, the people who raised me, and being the lives that I want to preserve, that I can do that too. And it's not going to be the end of the world.
Absolutely. And I think, wherever we are, whether, whatever the geographical location is, I think somehow that still speaks through us. Because we can write about Michigan. I'm writing about the hummingbirds, or I'm writing about the white-crowned sparrow that's on my deck, and I'm, bringing Sufi philosophy and negative capability into that poem. So I personally feel because of our backgrounds, there's so much richness that we can weave in and out, and we can have the simplest and the skinniest little poem, but then you can have like this almost epic kind of poem with the speculative and the science fiction. And so I think we are opening doors, and I think we're just breaking out of many of these molds. Some of them may still be good molds, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. And sometimes I don't even think there's anything terribly wrong with certain cliches, because from the Indian culture and our Indian epics, as well as Greek ones, right? We have certain modes of comparison that are revered, and then we have symbolism that's very revered. So I think it's how we use it and how effective that poem is.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much for this discussion. It's really great. What you're both saying, Brian and Zulka, reminds me that none of us are under any obligation to write to anybody else's sense, whether speculative or not, of a vision that is restrictive.
Right.
So, for instance, Cynthia mentioned, having to imagine yourself being an Indonesian woman writing in English, which I also did, and that allowed us to find each other. But I also think, this concept of even what Indonesia is, we have over 700 languages and cultures. I cannot name, if you put a gun to my head, I could not name you all the over 700 languages in our country. It's this whole sense of being a native informant, right, that we have to push against, because it's like, oh, you should only write about Indian. What is India? Which languages are you talking about here? What sense of geography? Like which annal of history? Like
right.
It's
maybe 1,000 languages. Which one do you want me to pick?
Yeah,
exactly.
In India, right? India is very polyglot. Cynthia, do you want to, because you mentioned you found yourself as one of the only Indonesian writers in English, and yet when I look at your work, I see that you are radically experimental. You play with typography, you use caesuras, you write prose poems. And so there's a way in which you're pushing the bounds. And I feel like maybe you never had that pressure, or you subverted the pressure to speak on behalf of.
You know, it was really that is like probably the only silver lining of becoming a young teen mother. I had a son at 17 and basically did the worst possible thing that Indonesians could imagine. So there was also, you know, had experienced also this kind of like really intense personal exile, I think, from my diaspora, from my family. And it's so painful and it's so liberating because that's freedom, right? And that I had to, it took me a long time to sort of like bring the pieces back together. I think for a really long time, and even to this day, I think the question that really drives my work is like, is reconciliation possible? You know, it's like, is it possible? Is repair truly possible? What might that look like? To me, like that's a speculative like project of my life.
Wow.
And when I think about, you know, experimentation, you know, I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia for the ancestors. I feel like the ancestors also got us here. And there's so much of the patriarchy that is like horrifying, that is also like the work, the sustained work of multiple generations of ancestors. So I also feel like I think a lot about like, what does it mean to become the ancestors that we need? And what and how diaspora, like existing in diaspora, having to search for minds and hearts to be in communion with, like so far beyond the Indonesian tradition, because Indonesian literature was not, because due to lack of translation, because so many of our writers were killed off. Like there's like a generation of them that we lost as well. I had to go looking, you know, for other minds to be in conversation with that were from all over the world. And so the way that actually also helped me to think about like ancestry, literary, artistic, aesthetic, political ancestry, to be like much more expansive, you know. It has to go beyond the nation state, which is like what we have. It has to go beyond English because that's what we have. It even has to go beyond like ideas of like what it means to be independent, only in relation to colonization.
Right.
Right? Because like that is even like the way that we imagine like a people's independence is so still tied up to like some crap that like, you know, Europeans did like a couple of 100 years ago. And so I think a lot of the recovery, I feel like that I feel really invested in doing has to do with germinating like those ideas for like, what might autonomy look like? What might relationship look like in the future? What might translation look like in the future? You know, what do bodies, what do able bodies, you know, like even like the way that we imagine like what we are capable of, like what the expectations are of us around like how to be capable, what the definitions of that are, like how do we liberate that as much as possible from, I don't know, just being a reaction, if that makes sense, to what we've inherited. Does that?
Yeah, no, I remember a line from that poem. You said the migrant feminist is unattached to ancestors and their judgments like rotting fruit, which was a line I really liked. Ben, do you want to weigh in on this? And I'm curious if you, because you read a couple of elegiac poems, but do you feel compelled in any way to kind of write about your identity? And to make that kind of a prominent component of your work? Is there a tension between kind of the aesthetic and the political?
Well, sure. I mean, as an out gay man writing poems about gay experience explicitly and dealing, like the Days of 1993 poem about HIV testing, it's sort of implicit. But my sense is that that it's incumbent upon us to write truthfully about our own experience and trust that collectively we are creating definition, that if I were to try to create definition in a self-conscious way, I would limit it. That my experience, if recorded in a sensitive, honest, full way, will be fuller than any sort of conscious project I could to define my community or to make assertions about it. That if I'm just honest about the life I'm living, and others are, that together we will constitute a truer definition than anybody could by trying to impose a shape, if that makes sense.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, really well said. Well, I'm
I mean,
just looking at the clock, and I realize we're kind of getting close to time, but we have a kind of ritual here at Isobreak when we finish off. And what a great reading! Thank you all for both the conversation and for sharing your work. The tradition is kind of the digestif at the end of a great meal, or the little fortune cookie after you've eaten. And so just go around to everyone and have you just share with us something that you're thinking about, something that is invigorating you, something you're concerned about, something you're reading, or that you want others to think about, something in your own work, a parting bit of wisdom. So we'll just let's go around and we'll hear from everyone. And Zilka, do you want to start?
Can I go later?
Oh, sure. You
Talk about it a little bit.
Is anyone willing to kick us off here with what they're? I might just mention, because I was mentioning Afrofuturism, and there is this great book by Letitia Womack called Afrofuturism: The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, that has great images as well as stories and little excerpts from Sun Ra. And so it's something that I discovered recently and that I've been really grooving on. So I'll just throw that out there into our collective stew. Brian, you have anything? Do you mind kicking us off?
I mean, the big thing that I've been looking at these days is about how to encourage everyone to become comfortable with risk and even outright failure. How do we take joy then to save it? It's great to be a kind of like a winner, to be recognized widely in all of our materials in the fields. But I think the question is that, in our literary communities, what happens when you have a project that doesn't go the way that you wanted it to go? That without pointing to a particular community where if they screw it up, they still get to do another book deal. They still get to go on with their literary career. Whereas BIPOC writers, those of us from marginalized communities, oh no, you always have to have that A-list book that always knocks it out of a park every single time. I think that many of us then kind of quaking feel like, which one is it? Which one is it? Which one's the book that I write that's going to kill my career? It's like no. I'm looking forward to trying to figure out, okay, no, how do I create a book where we can model it to others? But no, it's not a great bestseller or something like that. You may not think it's my greatest book, but you know what? I'm going to make one the next day anyway, and I'm going to make an all new one then. And maybe that one sucks too, but you know what? That's still creating the culture, that still builds it, and it hopefully gives other people the courage to also say, I can keep trying until I make the types of creations that I want to.
Yeah, as Samuel Beckett said, try again, fail again, fail better. Right. So as a way, and it's interesting you mentioned, we were talking a little bit about prize culture, and does that ultimately help or hinder creativity is something that we could think about as well. Oka?
Let's see. I've been reading, I'm part of this anthology that's out with Tilted X. It's called Violent Phenomena, 21 Essays on Translation. And just reading the other writers in that and feeling like I'm in dialogue with them is really, has been pretty gratifying in terms of, I feel like translation is still there are people who approach things in many different ways, and sometimes you can feel quite isolated, especially as part of the global majority doing translation. But it's really gratifying to just be in a group with people who are like-minded and yet also are kind of blowing my minds with things I never even thought of. So
you are the editor of Modern Poetry and Translation.
Yes,
can you tell us, what are you looking for? What is going on with that journal?
What is going on with that magazine? That's like story of my life right now as I put together my first issue. What is going on with this magazine? It's really I feel very fortunate. I'm the first editor of color in the magazine's 65-year history. Thank you, but I also do feel that pressure, so that's why I'm like, oh my god, this first issue I gotta really. But I'm also trying to be kinder to myself and sort of step away from the perfectionist, although it's difficult, perfectionism model. But I truly encourage everybody in, New York Writers Workshop and Asian American Writers Workshop to check it out. We have a lot of back issues and material for free online if you want to check that out, and also to submit. So the issue that I've just finished wrapping up is entitled The Food Issue. It's called Wrap It in Banana Leaves, the food focus. And Cynthia, the covers, and I got an Indonesian illustrator from Bandung to do an illustration of tumpeng, which is like a yellow rice dish. Yeah, so I'm very excited about that, and we're instituting. I'm beginning a new language justice column in each issue because I think that a consideration for the ethics of translation, what we're actually doing here, how it happens, how it gets published and marketed, and prize culture and all of that. I think we have these debates all the time when we talk shop, right, as writers. But that's something that I'm trying to bring into the magazine so we can have these conversations. So yeah, please.
Wonderfully, we can't wait for the food issue. Great.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
Cynthia, do you want to go next? And I also have a question. I want you to tell us who the artist of that gorgeous new book cover for Tinderbox was.
That's
That
beautiful.
Was really
The cover is beautiful.
Yeah. I will show it again. This is courtesy of Sandy Knight.
Oh,
Sandy.
yes, I love orchids.
KNIGH8. So like knight in shining armor. Literally. Thank you, Sandy.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about this line from Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And I feel like I've read that essay so many times, and I think I always glossed over this line for some reason. She asks, it's a proposal. She's like, how do we like bear the intimacy of scrutiny, flourish within it? And that's something that I've been thinking about. It's like, how do I, because I feel like I have such a fraught relationship. I think BIPOC, can have such a fraught relationship to scrutiny because it can look like surveillance. It is often motivated by control. We are very often also doing it to each other. We are often doing it to our kids. Sometimes it's motivated by love, and sometimes it's motivated by other things. But like that, and then I've been also thinking about, we're so flooded with crisis like all of the time. And it makes it very, very difficult, and it's interesting that as poets, sort of like, I actually feel like my first dedication is to scrutinize, so it's like this kind of like, I hate being scrutinized, but I feel like my job is to scrutinize, and it's very confusing sometimes. And I'm thinking about like, how do we cultivate like communities and connections or networks, relationships, groups, like sort of like we were saying, Oka, with like meeting, they're almost like smaller pods, where we can learn to bear the intimacy that comes with that, like the intimacy that arrives for us with ourselves, with each other, with the world that so often actually feels hostile. So I think that's what I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, how to bear the intimacy of scrutiny. I think that's an interesting question. Ben?
This summer, one of my summer sort of projects was to read Anna Karenina, which I did, even though it was something of a forced march. And so many people, it seems, listed as their favorite book. And if anybody feels that way, more power to you. But I'm still seething with fury. I just wanted Anna to somehow take revenge on all of them. And I include Tolstoy with that. Like, I don't know. It just drove me crazy. Like And so I guess the serious part of that is, and I this is something that comes back to me. Why does that book have the cultural place it does? I don't understand it. It's a question of, what was translated. Is it because the message is finally so Christian? I found what happens to her character and the I found the treatment of her by both the author and all the characters intolerable for 800 pages, and I'll be seething for months about it. Let me just leave it.
There is this great book by Irina Rain called "What Happened to Anna Kay." You might be interested in that.
Goodness.
Novelization, but you might just be sick of any mention of the Russian landscape at this point.
Yeah.
Well, great, and let's finally finish with Zilka.
All right. After this, such wonderful speeches and eloquence, and I'm just, it's just so beautiful to be with all of you. I think in more simple terms, because that's who I am. I recently, because of all these things that have been happening in our lives, in our histories, and with COVID, with separation, with questioning what we do, and trying to bolster ourselves up, as poets, wherever we are, in poetry and what it means and who we are. I just kept thinking of the word churning. So I just went back to my earlier book, Sharp Blue Search of Flame. I think, Ravi, you may have read it. And I just kept coming back to this one line, because so much of what I'm thinking about more recently is about the history of my ancestors. And I've been going back a lot to the history of the Jews in India, all the different the communities of different origins. So the Ben Israelis, they're the Baghdadi Jews, which came with the trade routes, and they're the Kochini Jews. And then there are several smaller groups that have been found in Mizoram and in Andhra Pradesh. So how these histories, how did they happen? How did this happen? And who am I as part of these histories and diasporas? So I just want to read one line from here, which is sort of been hanging in my head somehow, and it comes from a poem called Child of Churning Water. And I'm just going to read this section. My salty songs sound no different than the gulls. My shadow hovers. I see my mouth opening and closing in air as if calling. No words but breath escapes my throat. I hear the murmur of ocean. Who shall I be now? I hear the murmur of ocean. Where can I perch? My woman heart is bird of the sea and fish of the air, blood and dirt, leaf and light, child of churning water. So I just wanted to end with that image of how they're constantly in this churning and becoming. So that's what is very much in my mind nowadays. So
Beautiful.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Zilka. And we didn't even get to talk about the wonderful visual installations that Oka and Cynthia have done. There's so much more that we can talk about, but we will stop here for today. So I want to thank all of you so much for taking some time and sharing your work. Those of you that are interested, you can check out apwriters.org. If you can make it to Bangalore, it'd be great to see you. Thank you again. I'm Ravi Shankar. This has been Isobreak, a APWT New York Writers Workshop co-production. Stay safe and creative, everyone. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.
Ravi.
All right, see you all.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you,
Everyone.
Brian, Cynthia. Thank you, Lindsay.
Bye, Brian. Cynthia.